Hello, everyone. Welcome to the series Mud Talks, Do Something Else, STEM in the Wine Industry with Diana Hawkins, class of '08. My name is Vanessa Chu, Assistant Director in the Office of Alumni and Parent Relations. We thank you for attending today's event, and we hope you and your family are safe and healthy during this time. This talk is being recorded and will be distributed along with presentation materials after the event. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat, and we will try to get through as many questions as we can after the presentation. Now, to briefly introduce our speaker, Diana Hawkins currently works as a winemaking consultant and is in the process of developing her own wine brand in New Zealand. She majored in engineering at Harvey and received her master's degree in wine science from the University of Auckland. I now turn it over to Diana. Diana, take it away.
Cool, thank you. All right, we're gonna go ahead and share this one. Cool. All right. So as Vanessa said, my name is Diana Hawkins. I'm from the class of 2008, and I'm here to talk to you about STEM in the wine industry and encourage you all to consider doing something else. So I'm sure you're wondering, who am I? How nerdy is the wine industry really? And of course, what's the problem that I mentioned in this blurb for the chat? So since graduating from Harvey in 2008, I had a corporate sales job for a few years. Between Harvey and the corporate sales job, that's where I developed my passion for wine. There was a wine club at Harvey at the time, and I continued enjoying wine afterwards, going on wine vacations and things like that, and really just kind of trying to learn everything I could. I became really, really curious. So curious that I decided to go ahead and quit my corporate sales job back in 2012. I quit that job and went to go work as a clerk at a wine shop, and then as a sommelier or kind of wine professional in the restaurant industry. So I did that for about 5 years, working at, your standard restaurants that you go to maybe every day, all the way to, those fine dining restaurants you see on like Chef's Table on Netflix. So I did that for about 5 years. And then in 2017, I went ahead and moved to New Zealand to do my master's in wine science. I had a lot of questions, and while I enjoyed my time working in the restaurant industry and learning more about the history of wine and different flavor profiles and things like that, I'm a nerd, so I became really curious about more of the scientific aspect behind winemaking. So that's how I ended up in New Zealand, which is where I am right now. And I graduated back in 2019, and I've been working as an assistant winemaker and winemaking consultant ever since. So that's a little bit about me. And so I want to talk about your survey responses because I thought they were really encouraging. So I asked you if you thought your STEM skills could be leveraged by the wine industry. The vast majority of you said, yep, absolutely. And it's really cool that you were able to really quickly see those links. And for the rest of you who weren't quite sure, I'm here to tell you a little bit more information so maybe you can see some of those connections and see maybe where your skill set can fit in. So how nerdy is the wine industry really? So the wine industry is pretty nerdy. It's very nerdy. There's a lot of scientific things that go into not just the winemaking process, but a lot of research that is undertaken. And one of the things I'm going to do to give you an example of this is to talk to you a little bit about my master's thesis and my research that I did there. So for my master's thesis, I sought to answer the question, do yeast influence regional wine character? And I'm sure you're probably wondering, what is regional wine character? And so regional wine character is this concept that climate, weather, grape variety, and soil are all things that go into making a bottle of wine different from another. So all of those things are what go into making, say, a Chardonnay from California taste different than a Chardonnay from France or a Chardonnay from New Zealand. So that's what regional character is. People often call it terroir. That's a French word you can use to describe it. And so what I was looking at is, okay, all of these things, climate, weather, grape variety, soil, they all go into making up regional wine character. That's well understood. But the question became, is there a part or a microbial component to regional wine character? do yeast have any influence in regional wine character? And you may be asking, why yeast? What is it about yeast that is so interesting? And for that, we have to go through a little bit of basics. So the thing you need to know is that yeast are directly responsible for the alcoholic fermentation process that occurs in wine. And so yeast plus sugar. In the case of wine, that sugar is coming directly from the grapes themselves, those grape berries. So yeast plus sugar is going to give you ethanol, carbon dioxide, and several different aroma and flavor compounds. So that's kind of the formula. That's what you get whenever you ferment. And Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the image that you see over there. That is one of the yeast species that is kind of the most famous and kind of the best at fermenting. So you use it a lot when you're making wine. It's also the species used to brew beer. So if you do any home brew, you may be familiar with it. And if you have a sourdough starter that you have begun this year, that's the same yeast that's going into there, right? So different sugars, but same kind of process, same yeast involved. And I do want to say that Saccharomyces cerevisiae is not the only yeast strain that can ferment. It's just the most efficient at it. All right, so for the purposes of my thesis, I was specifically looking at different aromas and flavor compounds that the yeast are producing. Cool. So when you're a winemaker, there's important decisions that you need to make. And these decisions also kind of inform what I did for my thesis in research. So there's really kind of two ways to think about it. When you ferment, you can either choose to deliberately add yeast. And when you're deliberately adding yeast, you're usually adding what we call commercial yeast. So these are yeast you can buy at the store. There's a, Bob's Red Mill is there. There's different ones for wine, obviously, but it's kind of the same concept. You go, you buy it, you know what you're getting, you know what it's going to do and how it's going to work. Totally fine. And again, these are yeast that winemakers are adding to a ferment. The other choice is to not do anything at all. And so you pick your grapes, you squish them, and you just leave them, and fermentation will occur naturally. And when this occurs, we say you're using wild yeast, or these cute little guys over here. So when you're using wild yeast, you don't really know what you're getting. They may be Saccharomyces cerevisiae, they may be other species, and oftentimes it's an entire yeast community. So you're getting more than one species or strain in that ferment. And it's pretty widely believed that these fermentations are going to give you a better indication of regional character. And so those were the ones I was focusing on for my master's research, those little guys. Cool. So now that we've covered some basics, I'm going to get into a little bit more of what exactly I did. So I was more curious about Pinot Noir. I like drinking it. Hopefully you do too. And there are 3 major wine growing regions for Pinot Noir within New Zealand. So you've got Central Otago and Marlborough, which are both on the South Island. And then you've got Martinborough, which is up on the North Island. And so I had different vineyard sites that I looked at from each one of these regions. And I had different yeast communities from each one of these regions. So I had 6 different yeast communities for for Marlborough and Martinborough, and 5 for Central Otago. You don't need to know that or remember the codes or anything, but just so you have some information. So then the first thing I did once I received my yeast communities is I decided to figure out what they were. It's important to know. So I isolated yeast from these communities. I did some biological analysis and things and grouped them into cohorts based on their band patterns. And then I used genetic sequencing to identify what the species were in my samples. So I did this for all of them, and I am not going to go into a lot more depth than that. If you have any more questions, I am more than happy to answer those via email. I spoke for an hour just on my thesis. I'm not going to do that here. So, yeah. So then after I identified which yeast species made up my communities, I then did fermentation trials in triplicate. And the way I designed these fermentation trials was such that the only variable was the communities that I had. So all the grape juice was the same, the fermentation vessel was the same. So I used those French presses that you see in that image there. And then I fermented them. After they were finished fermenting, I then took the wine that they made and I measured some aroma compounds that have been attributed to yeast species specifically. So I measured them using a GC mass spec. And then again, if you have any questions about exactly what I did, happy to answer that via email, but that's kind of the gist. Did the ferment, the only variable involved was the yeast communities, took the finished wine and measured the aroma compounds. So then did some statistical analysis and got some graphs here. So when looking at the region of origin for these communities and their impact on wine aroma, we've got the three regions there. So you've got Martinborough, which is those purple triangles, Central Otago, which is the green squares, and Marlborough, which is kind of the orangish or reddish circles on your screens there. And so when looking at this, it's kind of important to see what's separate from the others. And so you see that Martinborough, those purple triangles are kind of more off to one side compared to say Central Otago and Marlborough, where there's a bit more overlap. So if you remember from the map, Martinborough, those purple triangles are from a different island of New Zealand. New Zealand has two islands, the north and the south, and Central Otago and Marlborough are on that same South Island. So I suspect that's why there is a little bit more overlap between Central Otago and Marlborough compared to the other region. Additionally, Central Otago and Marlborough are two of the biggest wine growing regions in New Zealand. And what's important to note there is that there's a lot of human activity. And we know that humans spread things pretty easily. Things get on people's boots and their clothes and things like that. And they can easily bring things from one region to another. So there is some evidence that there could be some human dispersal activity of yeast going on here. But all that to say, when we look at the final number, it was pretty significant. So the region of origin explained about 10.9% of the variance we observed in wine aroma, which is great. That was kind of what I was hoping to see. And it's always nice when that kind of lines up. And so the yeast community region of origin matters, which is an important result. So not being one to just be satisfied with that and having a lot of data, I decided to look at another aspect that I thought would really matter and make a difference, potentially. And that was the community makeup. So this is not a biology class or lesson or anything. You don't need to remember all of the species up in the upper right-hand corner, but I know some people would probably be wondering what they are. So there you have it for the curious. So what's important to note here is when looking at the community makeup and putting it through my statistical analysis, I used what I call presence absence method. So anything that had Saccharomyces cerevisiae in there had an A. If it didn't have it, I didn't use the A. So what you can see here, again, looking at things that are clustered away from each other is important and implies significance. So you can see that any community that had Saccharomyces cerevisiae present is well separated from those that did not. And that's pretty cool. It means that there were obviously a lot of differences in the aroma profiles from those communities that had Saccharomyces cerevisiae compared to those that did not. And then I also saw this in the fermentation kinetics as well, but we're not going to talk about that. And so I did a similar statistical analysis like I did for the region of origin. And when we do that, it became apparent that the community makeup was a pretty big deal. So it explains about 48% of the variance we see in wine aroma. And so before we knew the region of origin definitely mattered, and now we know the community makeup really matters. So what species are in that community is a pretty big indicator of potential aromas that you're going to get. We saw some direct links, but yeah, the community makeup and species that are there is a pretty big deal. You may be wondering why these numbers are not the same. I think that that could likely be due to the fact that I was just looking at species. I was not looking at strains, and that is an area for future work. So if you're curious about that, I'm happy to discuss what I did, and you can take it up on yourself because I'm not doing a PhD. So there you go. Cool. So in summary, when looking at the yeast communities and their makeup, if you look at that and then the region of origin that they come from, they make up about 58% of regional character that you see in wine. So I know a lot of people make a big deal about the soil type. They talk about dirt. If you go to tasting rooms and things like that, there's occasionally you'll see jars of dirt. They'll tell you the soil types and things like that. The soil type and the climate and the weather, all of that obviously has an influence, but you can't rule out these little guys. They're doing some pretty cool things as well. And so as I tell everybody, stop collecting the dirt. You can if you really want to remember where you were. It does have a big impact, but the regional character, I think, has some other aspects to it as well. So Vanessa, I don't know if this is a good time to kind of pause for a moment and take any questions. I know I saw some things going up in the chat, and then we can resume and talk about some of the problems and challenges facing the industry.
So one of our questions is, how is aroma defined or measured? Oh,
that is a very good question. Oh boy. So basically there, I would be happy to send an email to this person as well, because I know I'm going to miss things off the top of my head. But basically, wine aromas are chemical compounds. So if you think of wine, it's a very complex chemical matrix. And so these aroma compounds are coming from the yeast produce them themselves. So they eat sugar and they're producing metabolites, or like, as they're doing their thing. And some of those metabolites that they produce are wine aromas. The grapes themselves also have what we call aroma precursors, where the yeast can break these down and then those kind of release the aromas. And then the grapes themselves also have aromas. So that's kind of where the aromas are coming from. And then in terms of how to measure that, I'm going to say for all the analytical chemists out there, this is for you. This is your thing. I worked with a couple who kind of guided me through the process. But basically, I took my sample and I ran it through the Juicy mass spec, looking for certain peaks. I had some chemical standards and things that I had to use to calibrate that equipment. And then that allowed me to measure, I believe I was looking for about 32 aroma compounds that are yeast derived all up. These are, again, just chemical things that I'm measuring and looking for certain peaks in hydrogen ratios and things like that. And then based on these peaks, I could kind of say, okay, this is how much is present within my sample. So that's kind of how I was able to do it. And I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure, but I can send you an email.
Our next question is, do the big New Zealand wineries use wild yeast and exclusively?
I would say the larger ones do not. So the larger ones typically don't. They will typically be using a lot more commercial yeast. That's mostly because they're more reliable. I would say they may do like a couple of one-off batches of wild yeast. And then there are some wineries in New Zealand that will also kind of, I call it splitting the difference. Cumeu River is a good example of this. They're a Chardonnay producer in Auckland that makes stunning Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And they actually have cultured wild yeast up. So they've kind of looked at all their fermentations that were done with wild yeast, isolated their favorites and kind of kept them. So they've got their whole little like yeast library. But I would say that wild yeast is more common in terms of like smaller to medium-sized producers. But when you start talking about like big scale, you're talking about like 200,000 plus liters of wine. A lot of winemakers just don't want to take the risk because they are unpredictable.
Cool. Great, thank you. We have a few more questions. Do you want to take one more, Diana?
Yeah, I'll take one more now and then I'll answer some more at the end.
Okay. Was there any predominant aroma compound that made a particular region distinctive?
Yeah, there were. There were a couple of them. And I am going to have to send you an email about all of them because I think there ended up being between 5 and 7 that were a little bit different. I know beta damascicone was one of them, and I'm sure I'm not saying that right, but I can send you a list about which ones were different. The other thing that was really readily apparent was the fermentation kinetics. That was basically how efficient were the yeast at eating all of that sugar? How fast did they eat all of the sugar present? And then, how long the fermentation actually took. And I will definitely tell you that a lot of the species from Martinborough were not good at fermenting. And I remember that very clearly from my trials. And they also had the most communities without Saccharomyces cerevisiae present, which I think is probably why they did not know that they were supposed to be fermenting, I think. So, yeah, cool. All right, so I'll take more questions after, but I do want to just talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges facing the wine industry. And yeah. So what's the problem? And there are a lot of them. So I'm not going to go through all of these, and this is by far not an exhaustive list. But starting in the vineyard, there's a big labor shortage. So there are not enough agricultural workers, and this is a global situation, that are, I think, able to do the work. Some of them, a lot of people do not want to do the work. And then a lot of it is also that people need to be trained up, and the training process can take a little bit of time. So this labor shortage impacts, I don't know a single wine region that is not impacted by this. I think it's an issue for the agricultural industry as a whole. And wine at the end of the day is an agricultural product. I know people, don't think of it like that, but somebody's got to grow the grapes in order to make the wine. And then that kind of goes along with the other problem, which is that there's this information gap. And so we need to make it easier for people, especially vineyard managers, who are now, instead of managing like a small plot of land, they're now managing vast, enormous vineyards. Think about it like, I think people have this romantic idea of somebody going outside, taking a leisurely stroll through their vineyard block and assessing everything. That's really great if you're able to do that, but most properties are far larger than that. And that's when you start looking at, okay, how can we bridge this information gap? Can we deploy drones? What technology can we use that can sync, data being recorded at weather stations around the vineyard properly, let's say, that measures things like soil moisture and sunlight and even sap flow from the trunks all the way to the grapes to really determine, okay, when do we harvest? What areas of the vineyards need irrigation? What areas are going to be prone maybe more to disease pressures and things like that. And those are some areas that I think technology could definitely be applied, both with the labor shortage in terms of giving more automation to some of these tasks. I know we have mechanical harvesters and some mechanical pruning methods can be deployed, but I think we need to look at more automation in the vineyard. I mean, we're talking about an industry where one of the, and this is going to sound crazy, one of the issues is mowing the grass in between the vines. And both that there's not a lot of, that requires somebody to go out on a tractor or mower to mow it. And it needs to be done pretty frequently. And there are some consequences to that. One, that's taking a person away that you could use to do something else, which we're talking about a labor shortage. And the other piece of that is you're compacting the soil, which is not great for the plants. So I joke, if you could just have like a all-terrain mowing Roomba for the vineyard, that would be a huge game changer. And I know the engineers here are laughing, but seriously, that would be a huge help. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about in the winery is regard to the carbon footprint. So there is a lot of plastic that's involved in the winemaking process that is somewhat unavoidable just because of we want things that are going to be easily sanitized and cleaned, and things that don't impart any flavor. And so you get all these plastics, and the hoses are plastic, everything's packaged in plastic, and it just kind of adds up and up and up. And as somebody who doesn't like a lot of plastic, I think that's a problem for me and that I see the industry struggles with. And the other is the emissions. So a lot of those oaky flavors such as vanilla, baking spice, kind of toasty things that people enjoy, especially in red wine, but also in some white wines like Chardonnay, those are usually coming from French oak barrels. They're called French oak because all of them come from France. And so when you're shipping barrels, thousands and thousands of barrels worldwide, that's going to add up in terms of your carbon footprint. Similarly, glass bottles are pretty heavy, and they're not really the most efficient packaging for shipping liquids. They're just a historical packaging for shipping liquids. And so there's just a lot of emissions involved in shipping bottles of wine around as well. The carbon problem I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth later, but remember that equation, that's going to come back. And then of course there's climate change. The wildfires this year were pretty bad in California, as you are undoubtedly aware. And then in New Zealand, that has climate change is kind of presenting itself as more rain at strange times. For example, we've had a lot of rainstorms this year, like this past week, and one region got, I think, 400% of their wine for the entire, of their rain for the entire month of November in one day, which is too much. It's like a monsoon. And the other thing that has been attributed to climate change is this whole idea of the ripening is not happening evenly. Before, sugar and flavors, those flavor compounds I talked about that are in the grapes, they would develop at the same time. Now you're getting sugar developing faster than flavors. They're kind of out of whack. And then pest and disease. There's a lot more invasive species being transported around now than there was before. And then there's this issue of genetic stagnation, which I'll talk about more in a moment. So this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the problems. And I know that there are solutions out there. And I know the industry would really like it if we could make some more advances to addressing these. So I'm going to focus on my top two picks, and those are the carbon problem and this issue of genetic stagnation. So for the carbon problem, I want you to remember that equation from before. So yeast plus sugar gives you ethanol, carbon dioxide, aromas, and flavors. And so for this part, we're going to specifically be looking at the carbon dioxide component in this equation. Cool. So carbon from the winemaking process is 5 times more concentrated than planes and cars. Why aren't we trapping it? It's a great question. I think that the reason why it's not being captured is because there is this belief, and it's true, that the grapevines themselves, they photosynthesize, they're sucking the CO2 out, it's getting bound up, and so it's kind of like a natural cycle. Fine, totally fair. That's happening. However, we have so many other emissions as part of the wine industry, and I believe that climate change is already so far down the line that I think any places that we can capture carbon should be looked at and considered seriously. So I just want to say that, but I do want to let you know exactly how much carbon we're talking about. So 1 glass of wine that's about 13.5% alcohol equates to roughly 16.5 grams of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. When you're talking about a bottle, just simple math, that's 82.5 grams of carbon dioxide released. Cool. There were 290 million hectoliters of wine made globally back in 2019. So doing some simple math there, that comes out to about 3.2 million tons of carbon dioxide being released. So it's kind of a lot. And as I mentioned before, some of it is being captured via, this vineyard life cycle, but not all of it's being captured. And I think that that's something that we should really look at addressing. I think it's also important to note that in the winemaking process, carbon dioxide is also being utilized. And so we are fermenting the wine, releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere where it goes and gets gobbled up by the vines, hopefully in something else, but maybe not. And then at the same time, later on in the year, let's say when we're getting ready to bottle something or move things around, we may then purchase more carbon dioxide in the form of canisters. It would be so great if we could just somehow trap that CO2 that happened during fermentation, keep it, and then reuse it when we need it later. So we're not bringing more carbon dioxide in and thus driving our carbon footprint even further up. So there are some ways to take carbon out via expensive machines. They're not cheap, and it adds up pretty quickly, especially given the fact that some, if you're trading carbon on exchange like they do in Europe, it's often cheaper just to buy the carbon credit than it is to use these machines. And then there are some people who, these are still being researched. This is all in the research and development stage, but they're looking at, can we use algae to absorb some of this carbon, and then maybe use the algae out in the vineyard. So it's kind of like fully completing that life cycle even more. Or can we somehow convert the carbon dioxide into chalk, and then that way it's captured and trapped. But then it's like, well, what do you do with all this chalk? And I know it's something that a lot of winemakers wish there was a solution for, but there just isn't one that's really practical. And so we're currently taking any and all suggestions for this. Right now, the answer seems to be plant more trees, hope for the best. And again, some of it is being trapped by the grapevines themselves, but given our carbon footprint, I think we should really critically look at doing better. Cool. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is what I call genetic stagnation, or the perfect storm. So before I get into this in too much depth, I do need to cover a couple more basics about the genetics of grapevines. So, okay, there's the genus Vitis. It has more branches than two, but we're just going to look at two for today. That's the genus for all grapevines. There's Vitis vinifera, and then Vitis labrusca and riparia. There's not a test on these Latin names. You don't need to worry about that. So one branch is from Europe. The other branch is from North America. And one is really, really tasty and delicious. And one is slightly less tasty, but super robust and hardy and really resistant to a lot of things. Guess which one we like the most? We like these super tasty grapevine species so much that we are no longer letting it naturally evolve. So the primary method of propagation for grapevines is via clonal selection and vegetative propagation. So, you know, you see something that's doing really well, you keep that, and then you just kind of keep cloning it. And most grapevines in the vineyard are reproducing asexually as well. So that's kind of another contributor to why they're no longer naturally evolving. We did something similar with dogs. So we took this wolf that was, you know, super robust, and then got this cute little puppy that's not going to survive in the woods, right? So you can think of it like that if you want to, if that helps. But at least dogs aren't all clones. So the clonal piece is important here. So I took the most popular grape varieties that are in the US. These are them. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these names. And so these grapevines are really tasty. People really enjoy them. They are all Vitis vinifera. So that super tasty category I mentioned before. And they're not very robust. So they don't have a lot of fungal defenses. Cabernet Sauvignon kind of does, mainly because the skins of that grape are very thick. But other than that, it doesn't really have anything that it can use to fend itself off. So this created a problem back in the late 1800s, beginning of the kind of late 19th century, and that there were a lot of fungal diseases that were ravaging vineyards in France and the rest of Europe. There were a lot of vineyard pests and insects in particular that were decimating the industry at that time. And so scientists got together and they said, you know what, we're going to fix this. We've got a whole solution. We are going to make some hybrids. So they did. They made some hybrids of the super tasty variety and these super hardy varieties to make these tasty, hardy hybrids. Problem solved. Go on about your business, everybody. Best of both worlds, right? So these are two actual hybrid varieties. Regent is a red wine hybrid variety, and Vital Blanc is a white grape hybrid variety. They are very robust and very hardy. Funguses cannot really affect them, and they're pretty tasty. Kind of. So they're not popular wines. People still don't want to drink them. So we're kind of back at the beginning, right? We've got this problem of, we've got these varieties that we really enjoy, but they're not very robust. And the ones that are more robust, we don't seem to enjoy as much, unfortunately. And the hits keep coming. So a lot of old pests that have been with grapevines the whole time have continued evolving while the grapevines have stayed stagnant. So they've caught up a lot and they're wreaking havoc currently. New pests are discovered. So the one off to the right there, that's the glassy wing sharpshooter, that little weird slender bug thing. That has a potential to spread a bacteria to grapevines that will kill them. And that is predominantly a problem in Southern California. So if you see one, tell somebody. The other one that you see up there, that very beautiful moth looking thing, is the spotted lanternfly. It is native to Southeast Asia, but it is causing chaos in Pennsylvania and the East Coast grapevine industry because it loves eating grapevines alive. And if you see one of those, please kill it and then also tell somebody, because we're trying to capture them and stop them from spreading any further than they already have. And then of course we've got climate change. So we've got more droughts and things like that happening. And at the moment, we are out of tools. So a lot of the chemical sprays that we have developed for these fungal infections and things like that they're still working, but they're not as effective as they used to be. And so we really need some better defenses. And so we need grapevines that can, survive these fungal infections, that are heat tolerant, that are drought tolerant, and that have better insect defenses. So we really need a lot more power to kind of help fight off this like multiple pronged threat. And the thing is, we know that from looking at the genome sequencing and everything of grapevines, that there are a lot of genes that are just, locked away in the genome that could be really, really useful if only we could unlock them and get them into these grapevines that we really like to taste. So geneticists, we really need your help with this. It's in the genome. We just gotta, unlock it and utilize it. I know that's a little simplified, but any help would be appreciated. Okay, so now what? So I mentioned carbon capture solutions that are both cost effective and efficient. Gene identification, and then maybe we could identify some genes that are a little bit, will make these vines more robust and hardy and things like that. And then maybe we can, genetically modify organisms or, do some grapevine breeding to really kind of help make these grapevines that we love so much more robust and hardier for the 21st century, because we really need some help with this, guys. So yeah, so at this point, I'll take your questions. And Vanessa, I don't know how you want to do this. I know I got a slew of them before the talk. Yeah, I can kind of go through some of the ones I got, or you can open it up.
Yeah, let's do some of the questions that you already, for the pre-submitted ones, and then we'll go through the Q&A. Cool.
All right, so so you guys asked me, is the wine industry actively searching to hire STEM-related majors, and how do I get into the wine industry? So I think what I would recommend doing is, a lot of universities need researchers. And I think that that's something that is, if you're looking for a career in academia, looking to do a PhD, things like that, you could always consider using certain parts of the wine industry as a medium or a model for your research. And then there are some companies that just do research and development. Like I know a lot of yeast companies, like some yeast commercial companies are always looking for researchers and things like that. As far as wineries go, they may be looking for somebody to help out in their lab. But I find that a lot of the lab jobs can be a little boring. And I think the academic side of things, more of those universities are going to be doing really exciting research areas. Cool. So I'm just going to paraphrase. What are the optimal conditions for wine grapes to be grown? I don't know if they're on, but somebody asked about the tropics. We want places that are going to be moderate to warm climates, typically ones that see some variation of like all 4 seasons, like colder winters, so the vines can go dormant, warm, sunny summers. And then this is important, low humidity. So this is a big issue with grapevines, is that if there's any humidity, those fungal infections will thrive in the moist environment, and they will kind of attack the leaves, and then photosynthesis goes down, and then production goes down, and the grapevines get sad. And why are certain wines regarded as the best in the world, i.e. like $1,000 a bottle for a recent vintage? So that has to do with a lot of things. You could look at their business model and try to figure out why, but usually if they don't have a lot of vineyard acreage and they have really low yields, that can contribute to a price going up. If they're doing everything by hand versus using like mechanical harvesters, that makes the price go up, because then you have to find these people that are hard to find to pick all the grapes and so on. If they're using a lot of oak barrels are expensive. I forget how much they cost now, but they're at least between $1,000 and $1,500 a pop. So if you're using a lot of new oak, that can be really expensive. And then those really heavy glass bottles you get with the wax seals and stuff, that's all really expensive packaging. And so sometimes the bottle cost itself is just driving up the price for the packaging. So if you buy a bottle and it comes in something that's really heavy and it's got a bunch of wax on it and it's wrapped in tissue paper in a wood box, that's why it's expensive as well. And then the land prices. So it's a business model. People need to make money. And so if they're spending like, I don't know, $30 million on some vineyard in Napa or something, they're going to have to make that back. And that usually means it's going to be expensive. But a lot of things go into it. So, yeah. And do I ever encounter snobbery? Oh, yeah. People here can be, some people in the wine industry can be pretty stuck up. But no, I still like to have fun. I lived in West Dorm, so yeah, definitely still like to have some good times. And what kind of pushback or bias did I come up against? I mean, I'm pretty stubborn, so I definitely got pushback, and there's lots of bias in the industry, but like I just don't let it get to me. And then I also am just really stubborn. So if somebody shuts a door, I'm just going to go like in through the side door or through the window, or I'm already in the house and they're locked out now. So that's just kind of how I am as a person. And what about the New York Times article? So there were about 21 women who came forward in the New York Times article to accuse some master sommeliers of sexual harassment and assault. And in terms of that New York Times article, I definitely have a lot of opinions about it, but I was not surprised, unfortunately. And I just hope that the industry can do better, because I think it's not just the court. I think that their power structure is just not great. But I think that the whole wine industry as a whole could really improve in that regard. But I don't know. I still think it's a pretty fun industry, and I've had a lot of success in it and a lot of fun and made a lot of great relationships and stuff. So I don't want that New York Times article to make it seem like it's everybody. It's just, I think, just a few people in that organization. So yeah. Any other questions? I think that was all I had for my question list.
Okay, great. So we do have quite a few more from our Q&A.
Yeah.
Can sugar, yeast, and fermentation conditions be chosen to achieve particular flavors and aromas?
Yes, they can. There's a lot, it depends on which flavors and aromas you're talking about, like which families of them and stuff. But yeah, you can, based on the different temperature that you're doing the fermentation at, you can get more or less of certain compounds. The different yeast strain you use can give you more or less of different compounds. It's like this endlessly variable situation. So yeah.
So why did you choose New Zealand for your studies?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's any like native Californians in the room. Basically, I went to college in California and I loved it, but I wanted to go see something else. And UC Davis is really expensive. And then I looked at other schools in the US, and this kind of became a common theme where they want you to choose either viticulture or the winery. You can't do both. And I wanted to see both. I wanted to learn both. And I didn't want to just say, okay, I just want to do this, or I just want to do that. And the other piece is I wanted to actually like go make wine. And so there are some universities that I think are more geared towards like research and things like that, which I think is fine and great and wonderful. For those of you who remember me from school, I think it's pretty crazy that I went and did a research-based thesis, because that's just like not my most natural thing. So yeah, I wanted something that was a bit more practical and hands-on, and that's how I ended up here in New Zealand with this program. So, and I did 1 year of research and I didn't have to do a PhD, so I was happy with that.
Very cool. Since the microbiome community on the skins of the grapes comes predominantly from the dust and soil, isn't microbiome of soil key, since this translates to what is in initial fermentation?
Very good question. So yes and no. So it's kind of coming from a lot of different places. And so when you look at the microbiome that exists on the outside of the grapes, some of it is from the soil, some of it is also coming from like the surrounding area and land. And then you've got things like bees and insects kind of acting as vectors, bringing it in from all over. And so while there are some, you can basically trace the fungal community on the grapevines, or excuse me, that come in on the grapes from the winery back into the vineyard. Once you start looking at the vineyard, this is what people in my research group were looking at, was the connection between the soil, the bark, the leaves, the grapevine microbiome, and the surrounding environment. They still have not really, the answer is yes and no, is that you can see traces of these yeast species on the grapes that are in the soil and the bark and everywhere else. But it's not like they're only from the soil. So that's kind of the other piece, is that there's this whole, it's like an entire ecosystem that you're trying to track down one thing from. I don't know if that answers it, but it's a really cool question. I find it endlessly fascinating. So.
Thank you. How stable are yeast species, and how quickly do wild yeast evolve?
That is a good question. In terms of stability, I'll talk about it both in the vineyard and then in the winery as well. So in the vineyard, this kind of also goes back to that microbiome question that the person asked about the soil, is that there is some slight variation from year to year. There just kind of is. So there is a little bit of variability there. However, they have also found that depending on what chemical sprays you're using and stuff, fortunately, the fungal community stays intact, which is good, but the bacterial does not. So if you talk about the whole one, that's a separate thing. I didn't look at bacteria at all. And then in terms of in the winery and how stable they are, like in the ferment, they ferment and usually they're fine. And then in terms of their evolution, I mean, within the fermentation, they're not evolving like a ton. But if you like swab some sample of your winery and then swab it the next year and the year after that, you may end up with some differences. I'm not really sure, but yeah.
Thank you. Other question, if the large producers don't use wild yeast, then the 58% regional character that you discussed is not necessarily accurate in those cases. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct. If you're using commercial yeast, and I know of a winery in particular that specifically uses one strain of commercial yeast across all of their ferments because they want the soil and the land to really speak, and they don't want any wild yeast whatsoever, and they just use this one strain. That's an approach, but you are going to not then be getting, you're like going to be missing, in my opinion, a huge piece of it. But for commercial reasons, I understand why they do it, because they just think it's too much risk. But yeah.
Great. Is there any market for GM vines, if not for smaller wineries, maybe for the larger commercial growers?
I think there is a space for genetically modified vines. I think we just have to convince consumers that it's not scary and it's that they can be comfortable with it. That's a whole nother conversation. And I know, for example, like genetically modified things are not allowed in New Zealand. And so what they do is they'll figure out what genes they want in the lab, and then they will go breed them in nature if they can to get to that end result. So that's an approach to kind of make it like natural, but still you're informed with your decisions. But yeah, I think there could be a place for that. And I think that going forward, we're going to need to really start thinking about it, especially as there's just so, it's kind of like everything coming to a head right now, especially with climate change too.
Great, thank you. So our last question for the night, what about biodynamics and organic farming?
Oh man. Yeah. I guess, is that like, can you ask them if that's like how it works or what is it, or in regards to what?
Let's give him a few minutes to respond to us.
Okay, cool.
And then, oh, why it's not used there,
Oh,
like in New Zealand.
oh, it is. It definitely is. There's lots of organic producers in New Zealand and biodynamic producers. So it's definitely a thing. In fact, a lot of the New Zealand wine industry they have a huge push for sustainability. And so they have pretty much every winery, every wine you see that's exported, I think to be exported, you have to be SWINS certified, which is the Sustainable New Zealand organization. So there's a huge push for sustainability here. There are organic vineyards here and organic wineries, same with the biodynamic side. I think that some people find the practices challenging because you have to go out into your vineyard a lot more and be more in tune of what's happening inside of it. To give you an idea, like conventional, and this is true for just farming in general, conventional farming, some guy tells you, okay, buy these sprays, spray them like this week, this week, this week, this week. You get kind of like a recipe you can follow. And then for organic and biodynamic, you really need to know exactly what's going on. And it's not that targeted, right? So I think it requires maybe just a lot more effort. And then also there are some places in certain parts that may be really difficult. So like when you talk about places that have more humidity and things like that, organic viticulture may be more challenging just because it's more humid and you're going to be constantly battling all these fungal infections. But yeah, there's definitely organic and biodynamic vineyards. I think it's more just about what the vineyard manager and winery want to do and what their focus is. And if that's something they're really passionate about, that's fine. Like I know a lot of the wineries in Central Otago are biodynamic or organic. Yeah, it's not uncommon here.
Great, thank you. So our last question of the night.
Okay.
So the smoke from the fires in Northern California negatively impacted the red wine grapes on the vines this year.
Mm-hmm.
What is
Yeah.
the mechanism that causes the problem?
Oh boy. Okay. So basically I'm going to say I'm not a chemist, but what's happening is essentially, so you've got smoke from the fire. It comes, it blankets the vines, and it depends on when it does it, like when it shows up and how long it stays. It was particularly bad this year because of the stage the grapes were in, which was almost ready to harvest, and because the smoke stayed and lingered for a long time. And what that does is it means the smoke then can kind of like get into the grape. So there's a chemical reaction, they get into the grape. And so you can taste these grapes, and this is the crazy part, they don't taste weird. They may not always taste like that. And it's only when you do a chemical analysis that you can really detect these compounds, which after fermentation can be released, and then that's the problem. So you really can't detect it until after you ferment. And so I guess the best way to think about this is using like, I'm gonna go with Lego blocks. So basically the smoke is a Lego block, the grape is a Lego block, you put them together, you're not going to get that if you're just eating it by yourself, but then the yeast will break it apart again. And then that's where you're getting the smoke after ferment. So that's my way of explaining that. I'm not a chemist, don't ask me the compounds, but that's what's happening. And that's why it was a problem.
That makes sense. Thank you. Diana, do you have any last remarks before we do our closing, just because we are almost done with our hour?
Okay. No, thank you guys for coming. I hope it was good. If you have any other questions, you can follow me on Instagram or send me an email or something. And yeah, if you want to support people of color in the wine industry, you can visit some of these places and I'll put those links in the PDF. But yeah, thanks for coming. And I hope it was informative. And sorry if I didn't get to answer your question, but I'm happy to do so later.
So yeah, for all the questions that are submitted and haven't been answered, we will definitely answer them for you. Diana, I want to thank you today for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for attending this event. We will follow up within the next week with a recorded video and presentation material. Our next Mud Talks is with Kyle Rossler, class of '89, who will be discussing self-publishing for fun and maybe profit on Thursday, December 3rd at 5 p.m. Pacific time. All upcoming events can be found on our online offerings page using the link included in your confirmation email or by visiting alumni.hmc.edu and clicking on online offerings. We welcome any suggestions you may have for upcoming events, or if you are interested in being one of our speakers, please email us at alumni@hmc.edu. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Diana. I hope you all have a great night and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.